Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the famous story of the war conducted beneath the Western Front, from the men who pioneered it, the methods they used, and the dangers of those on all sides. We'll study the art of tunnelling and mining in trench warfare. Well, hello, Dan. We've covered a lot of subjects so far in this podcast series. We've looked at the war in the trenches. We've looked at the war above the trenches as well when we considered air warfare. But this time we're actually going beneath the trenches. We're studying the underground war on the Western Front. And it's almost fair to say that the tunnelling that went underneath the trenches was almost as complicated and as labour-intensive as the work to maintain the trenches above them.
Yeah, hi Spence. Going to be a really interesting subject, and absolutely in response to what you've just said there, the work that goes on beneath ground in the Great War, quite famously, I think these days, the idea of mining and tunnelling on the First World War, it is fairly well known, thanks largely to some films that have come out in recent years, but it is absolutely just as complex, in some cases far more complex than the trenches themselves. One reason for that being, of course, that it's multi-level. So, in fact, you've got layers of tunnels and mines and souterrains and all these kind of things we'll cover in this episode, which are stacked one on top of the other. And in many cases, it mirrors the Western Front as well, which I'm sure we'll get into as we get through this subject. But fascinating topic. Really looking forward to diving into this one and finding out a bit more about it.
It really is a fascinating topic, and mine warfare is almost as old as human warfare. Certainly once you've reached the stage where an enemy might construct walls to hold off an attacker, you start having those attackers thinking about, well, how can we undermine those defences? And mine warfare had been a feature of warfare from antiquity right through the centuries, digging underneath castle walls, digging underneath fortress walls. And perhaps the first real undermining and detonation of an explosive beneath a trench in warfare really occurred actually in the American Civil War at the Battle of the Crater in 1864 during the Siege of Petersburg, where Union forces dug underneath the Confederate lines, detonated a mine, and then attempted to storm into the breach. It actually went terribly wrong for the Union. They were very heavily defeated at this battle. People got stuck in the crater. They couldn't escape. They were shot to pieces, unfortunately. But what it did mean is that on the eve of the First World War, all European armies had a serious consideration of using mining and tunnelling to get beneath fortresses. That was really the essence of how the engineers thought about this was going to be used. In fact, in 1907 in Britain, the Royal Engineers carried out a sample exercise where they constructed some fortifications in Britain. They actually burrowed underneath them, and then they detonated various explosives, black powder explosives actually, underneath these fortifications to demonstrate this was how you could breach a fortress wall. So the armies do go to war in 1914 expecting to encounter tunnelling and trench warfare, but what they expect is they anticipate using it against fortresses. Europe is dotted with fortresses, especially France and parts of Belgium, and that's where it's expected to be used. But it doesn't take long, of course, for the Germans initially to see that there's a real opportunity to use tunnelling against trench lines as well, Dan.
Yeah, entirely that. And the idea, of course, is, tunnel warfare, mine warfare, it really comes into its own when the above ground lines stop moving. And of course, in siege warfare, that's exactly what happens. You've got a castle that is not going anywhere. It means that you can target it over a prolonged period of time because tunnelling by its very nature is slow work. And the same thing applies really when you get to the story of the Western Front, because of course you get this huge, long, static line that winds its way down from the English Channel right the way down to the border of Switzerland. And that provides a multitude of opportunities in order to use things like tunnels and mines in their various different forms that we're going to talk about throughout this podcast. And just a quick word before we move on. I just love the word undermine. It's something that we use on a regular, daily basis in the English language. And quite often we don't think about its origins. But of course, it's quite simply to undermine a position. And that is something that we're going to be going into, of course, in plenty of detail throughout this particular podcast episode. But as you say, Spence, really the scene is set as soon as those lines settle down. It provides opportunities for all sides, and it's actually the Germans that are going to be making the first move here in December of 1914 to see just how explosives, trained tunnelers, some pretty impressive survey work beneath ground, of course, and some, if you like, some innovation in the early part of the war is going to have pretty severe consequences. And they're first seen on the 20th of December 1914 around the little village of Givenchy.
This is very true. And just a little point to note about the Germans and why they are the first to take up mining. One of the reasons is simply the German pioneer branch, its engineers effectively, is a much larger branch than exists in either the British or the French army. And it has a multitude of duties. It's there to construct. Initially, they construct trenches, help prepare the defences and so forth. But because it has larger numbers and therefore it's better funded, has more equipment, it's very quickly, once the defences are set up, it very quickly turns its mind to how can it start carrying out attacks. And whereas both the British and the French are actually thinking about tunnelling at this stage, they simply don't have the resources to really carry this out. The French are starting a little bit with this, but the Germans are ahead because they've got a stronger engineering branch. They're able to get better tools. They're able to call upon mining expertise. And it's they who plan this. And the planning about it is, considering it's only just starting, it draws a lot on pre-war German ideas about tunnelling underneath fortress walls. And the principle that they use is exactly the same. Construct a tunnel that's actually inside German lines. It's often thought the tunnels start in the German front line, and sometimes that happens, but later it becomes much easier to put the tunnels further behind. They're safer from artillery fire. You're not going to get trench raiders in. And then dig out at a depth of somewhere in the region of 20 to 30 feet underneath the ground, so not supremely deep at this stage. Dig out under the Western Front, across no man's land, get beneath the location of the, in this case, the Indian trenches. It's the Indian Corps they're facing. Create a mine shaft there, put in explosives, and then detonate them. And what's interesting about this is it's essentially the Battle of the Crater again. The Germans are going to detonate this mine. It's going to blow apart the Indian trench. And of course, this is 1914. These trenches are very shallow. There's very little defense in depth on the British and Indian sector. And then carry out an artillery bombardment and a limited attack as well to catch the defenders. They were going to be dazed and confused. Those who survived the explosion are going to be very confused about what's happening. People are going to be rushing to the mine crater to try and dig soldiers out who've been buried alive. And the entire sector is going to be very vulnerable to this burst of artillery fire and machine gun fire. And it's brutally effective. It kills hundreds of Indian and indeed British soldiers in this attack. And it gives real notice, I think, especially to the British army, that this is now going to be a feature of the Western Front. And we've talked so many times on this podcast about one side does something and the other side has to respond. And I think mine warfare is a classic example of this because it's clear that mining is a really serious threat. And the Allies, and this includes the French, are well aware that if the Germans have detonated one mine, it's highly likely there could be dozens of other mine shafts are slowly approaching the Allied lines underground. And something has to be done about that.
Yeah, and it's especially likely given the success, as you've just mentioned, of this first attack. It's actually 10 small 50-kilogram mines that go off in front of a double company of Gurkha troops, part of the Indian Brigade, and they do, as you say, tremendous damage. And because of the success of this, it makes it inevitable that it's going to be used again, and used again very quickly. And I think you're absolutely on point there, Spence, with what you say with regards to this, I suppose, tit-for-tat element that we've covered so many times on this podcast so far. It reminds me a little bit about the first use of gas in April 1915, where you get this wave of panic sweep through the Allied ranks saying, wow, we're behind the curve on this one. We need to catch up, and we need to catch up quickly. Now, doing anything in warfare quickly is generally quite tricky, particularly training up men, bringing out a whole branch of service, putting them through all the rigors of basic training and getting them kitted and equipped and all of this kind of thing and shipped out to the Western Front. This is going to take months, usually. In fact, This is one example in the Great War where you can see a real burst of efficiency. And the reason it's simply so efficient is because it's such a dangerous situation to be in. And we can enter, I think, the hero of this episode right here, Spence, at this point, a man by the name of John Norton-Griffiths, who does some incredible work in the early formation of the RE tunnelling companies.
This is one of the greatest characters, certainly from a British perspective, of the entire First World War. And colourful does not really do justice to this man's life. He's the son of a building contractor. He's born in Somerset in the 1870s. He falls out with his family when he's a teenager. He leaves home when he's 17. He's basically wasted his education. This is a man with tremendous energy, and he drifts through various things. He spends a brief time as a soldier, actually in the Life Guards, so quite an elite regiment. That doesn't really suit him. Then he heads out to South Africa, where he becomes a miner, and by the age of 17, he's actually become a deputy manager at a gold mine. So he's clearly got a great deal of ability. He fights in some colonial wars down in Africa, the Matabele War in particular. He becomes a South African policeman for a time. He serves in the Boer War. He moves around. He becomes an engineer on various projects throughout Africa and South America. And it's not just mining, it's also all kinds of things: road building, railway building, all sorts of construction, developing docks around the British Empire. This guy is all energy, all action, all the time. And in the midst of this, he manages to find time to get elected, actually as the Conservative Party MP for Wednesbury, which is not a million miles away from where I live now. And he'll be an MP through the entire First World War as well. So absolutely incredible character. At the outbreak of the war, he actually raises his own unit, King Edward's horse, at his own expense. He's a phenomenally rich man. He's done very well out of his engineering projects. But what his talent is of course, this is an engineering expert. He's not only in just building things, but also crucially in mining. And there's various accounts about exactly how Norton-Griffiths gets involved with the British war effort exactly. So he's raised a unit to start with, but that's not really what where his forte lies. His forte is going to lie in mining. Now, there's different accounts about exactly how this came about. It's been said that it was a pure chance meeting and so on. In actual fact, Norton-Griffiths has been writing to the War Office saying, look, I'm a highly experienced engineer and a miner. I think I can be useful to you. He's been writing to these. We have these letters. They're in the Royal Engineers Museum in Britain in their archive. And classic British way, nobody acts on any of this until the Germans detonate those mines beneath the Gurkhas, which we've just mentioned. And that then suddenly wakes everybody up at the War Office. And it's quite clear by January 1915, something has to be done about this. The Germans must have dozens of mines in progress. They have to be stopped. Whether it's a chance meeting or whether Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War, actually reaches towards Norton-Griffiths deliberately, it's not entirely clear. But what is clear is the two have a meeting, and Norton-Griffiths sells this vision to Lord Kitchener that, look, I can solve the British Army's mining problems if you put me in charge. I know more about mining than any other man in the British Empire. I'm an experienced soldier. He's seen plenty of action in colonial wars. I think I can do this if you put me in charge. And one of the strengths of the British military in the First World War is it's always willing, reluctantly at times, but it is always willing to call upon civilian expertise, even if that goes against the traditions of military discipline. And we actually see it time and time again in the British Army. This after initial resistance, civilian experts are brought in. But I don't think there's any more colourful than Norton-Griffiths, because this is a man who's very used to acting on his own initiative. He's very much an entrepreneur. He's very much a roguish character, a real adventurer. And yes, he's been in the military. He's experienced some military discipline, but he's going to do something that's quite outrageous from a military perspective, because the British Army has its engineers, the Royal Engineers, but they're not specifically trained for mining. They've actually got a multitude of duties. What Norton-Griffiths proposes is not to use the existing Royal Engineers, but instead to deliberately recruit civilian miners, many of whom are still in Britain. They're in protected work, effectively. They're in essential work. Recruit these tunnellers and miners. A lot of them are older men in their 30s or even their 40s. Bring them over to the Western Front on the grounds that it's easier to use a trained miner and a trained tunneler, even if they're not really used to military discipline, than it is to use a trained Royal Engineer and turn them into a miner. Because no matter how well trained you are as a Royal Engineer, you're not going to be as expert in mining as a man who might have been working in a mine since the age of 14 onwards. And so what he's going to do is bring over some of the roughest, toughest, most industrially militant, individually determined men in British society and say, you're now going to be part of a military unit. And this is the foundation of what becomes known as the Tunnelling Company's Royal Engineers. And just to add a little bit of weight to how outrageous this is to British Army perspective, initially, Norton-Griffiths wants to do two things. He wants to pay the miners a higher rate than the regular soldiers on the grounds that otherwise the miners won't come. They're well paid in Britain. Why would they come out and risk their lives on the Western Front unless they're offered good money? And he wants to put miners in charge of them on the grounds that miners are very tough, they're very independent, they won't respect military discipline unless they have one of their own commanding it. And initially, the Royal Engineers say, absolutely no way, you can have these tunnellers, but we're putting a Royal Engineer officer in charge of them. And it actually leads to all kinds of problems, and eventually Norton-Griffiths gets his own way, and by the end of 1915, early 16, he's allowed to have miners as officers in charge of his tunnellers instead. They don't need to have the Royal Engineer, the formal Royal Engineers in charge. But it's almost a sort of story out of a movie that you bring over these rough, tough, very determined men, put them into a new unit that's going to do something that they are on a scale that's not been seen before in military history, really, which is to undertake enormous mining works beneath the Western Front.
Yeah, it's a stunner of a story. It really is, and we could go on for a very long time about John Norton-Griffiths and some of the great stuff he does. But in effect, as you say, Spence, when we get to this point, tunneling companies are introduced. And I think it's 8 or 9 that are first created. And these are going to be around 14 officers and 300 other ranks each. So that's the kind of number we're talking about for an independent Royal Engineers tunneling company. They're then going to be brought in for specialist tasks up and down the British sector of the Western Front. Incidentally, about the same time that the Germans and the French are doing a very similar kind of thing. But, these guys, higher pay, generally much higher age, usually not great with military discipline for the reasons you've just pointed out there, but incredibly effective at mining, and they're given tasks. And for obvious reasons, these guys have been doing that job for 20 years. They're just going to come out to a different part of the world and they're going to be doing that job again, albeit in an even more dangerous environment. And one we should add that's even more dangerous to an environment that is very dangerous in the first place, let alone without somebody trying to kill you. So it takes incredible guts and bravery to come out and become one of these early pioneers in the Royal Engineers tunneling companies. Just a couple of words on Norton-Griffiths here from my point of view. One of the things I find fascinating about him is he's well known in the early months of the war and in the early months of the formation of the tunneling companies to be seen pottering around behind the lines in the Western Front in a beaten up old Rolls Royce filled to the brim with wine or brandy or champagne or cognac. And in effect, what he's going to do is go to battalion commanders who he might know, for example, that there might be 5 or 6 miners who've enlisted at the start of the war who are now serving in an infantry battalion. And he's quite simply going to bribe them with some bottles of booze to let go of their miners and allow them to join those tunneling companies. So actually, he's going to recruit in a fairly quick way, and he's going to be able to bring in these expertise into groups who are going to be very, very effective. And one of the other things that's really important about Norton-Griffiths and the mindset, and also the technical aspects that he brings to the war on the Western Front, particularly in the northern part of the British sector of the Western Front, around Ypres, and about as far down as the area of Loos, so really the northern half of the British sector, is he brings in a method called clay kicking. Clay kicking is vital. And it's a vital advantage, and one of the few real differences between the Brits and the Germans in this sense. It's, if you like, maybe a little difficult to explain on a podcast, but in effect, it's a technique that's been used in the UK, particularly around Manchester and the sewage works that are being done by Norton-Griffiths Company at that time. In effect, what we see is in the clay subsoil that we find in that part of the world, a technique has been pioneered which allows men to basically move through clay very, very quickly. The Germans, with their traditional pick method, can go through at about 2 yards a day. This method of clay kicking, which involves one man sitting on, if you like, a strangely triangular wooden board with his back to it, and literally kicking a spade into the face of into the face of a tunnel, then passing it over his shoulder. Not only is it much more silent than the traditional method of digging through clay, but it's also about 4 times as quick. And this is famously how Norton-Griffiths probably sells, and it may be a little apocryphal, but there's a great story of Norton-Griffiths sitting in Kitchener's office when he goes to see him to really show off what he can do. And apparently he takes the implements from the fireplace, and he uses the little coal scraper that you use to clean out your office fire. He sits on his on a rug in Kitchener's room, and he demonstrates clay kicking in front of him. This is the kind of guy that we're talking about here. Remarkable character. But nevertheless, he does get the nod. And eventually, really by the early part of 1915, we've already got thousands of guys out there in British Army uniforms now able to start really making an impact on the Western Front. And it is going to be a big impact because really Spence, 1915 and 1916, they're the heyday of mining on the Western Front.
They are. And the reasons for it are several-fold, really. One, it's really the Germans have started this race, and the French are going to be digging against the Germans are going to be digging against the French, and of course the British and the Germans are now in competition with each other. And in 1915, we've talked about this a lot, that the trenches are so deadlocked, it's so difficult to make progress. The British and the French suffer appalling casualties trying to storm German lines with very little success. The tank is still a year or more away. The proper artillery support is still a year or more away. So how do you do something to try and gain an advantage here? And tunneling and mining seems to offer that answer. The Germans have already shown it can be effective with their attack against the Gurkhas in 1914. Very quickly, the French and the British are planning, well, maybe that's the key to actually undermining the Germans and breaking their lines. And of course, the Germans, delighted by the success that they've had in 1914, are also expanding their mining operations against the Allies. And so the no man's land in front of the trenches becomes slowly but surely undermined. And it's worth commenting a little bit about some of the difficulties with this, because mining doesn't take place in every single sector of the Western Front. In some cases, it's just very, very difficult to mine. The ground is not suitable for mining. And it's interesting that where mining takes place on a really large scale between the British and the Germans around Flanders actually has all kinds of difficulties because of the high water table that's there. The ground is soft, so in that sense, it's relatively easy to dig into, but it's also very, very wet. And that requires an enormous amount of timber. It requires all kinds of systems to make sure this is possible, including, of course, special techniques, as you described, Dan, clay kicking, which the British use, but the Germans do not. And this battle underneath the ground between the two groups, between the Allies and the Germans, is very fascinating because quite quickly it becomes its own form of warfare, effectively. That both sides are not only trying to reach mine shaft or mines out towards their enemy lines, they're also trying to gradually start to build defensive mines that can intercept incoming enemy tunnels and stop them actually getting underneath the trenches. It's interesting in this respect that the British and the Germans tend to go for this in a much more formalized way. In fact, if you look at underground maps, of which there are now a number available, underground maps of British and German mining in 1915 and into early 16, you can see a much more formalized system of mines where you've got a central shaft, then basically a horizontal line of mine shafts that are all slowly moving towards the enemy line. And they both have an offensive purpose, get underneath it and blow it up, and a defensive purpose too, intercept enemy tunneling towards you. Whereas the French struggle a little bit with this because the French don't have the manpower. One thing we should stress is tunneling is very manpower intensive. It's not just the guys in the tunnels who are digging, it's also all the infantry who are tasked to support the tunnelers, because one thing tunneling produces is vast amounts of spoil. And you can't have spoil lying around your trenches. It will block them, it'll get in the way, but perhaps even more importantly, the enemy will see all that spoil building up and go, aha, they have a mine shaft that they're digging towards us. We should go and trench raid them and destroy it, or we should direct artillery on it. So that spoil has to be moved a long way away. And certainly in 1915, where automation on the Western Front is pretty limited, that's basically going to mean a lot of infantry with sacks lugging it to and from a point some distance behind the line. It is one of the most hated duties of both British and German soldiers. If you're an infantryman and you'll come out of the line and suddenly, oh, bad luck, you've got to go and move some spoil, you're going to be really fed up about that. It's back-breaking work, it's tedious work, it's seemingly endless work. And so, whereas the British and the Germans do go big on this and assign troops to it, certainly in 15, the French aren't so keen on it because it's super labour-intensive. So although you do see French mining and tunnelling, it tends to be more localised than the Germans and the British, who go very, very big on this idea. And that point about the amount of labour involved in tunnelling, I think is really worthy of just thinking a little more about, because as well as the tunnellers, you have your infantry who are moving spoil and lugging material up as well, because it's not just a case of digging a hole in the ground and continuously digging it to get to a point that you want to reach. In fact, mining is a very, very technical art, and it's going to need a lot of support. It's going to need the right tools. It's going to need vast amounts of timber to keep the tunnels from collapsing in on themselves. It's going to need specialists as well, not just your tunnellers, but certainly in the British Army, there are rescue squads get formed who are specialists who can go into a mine shaft if it's been flooded with carbon monoxide and drag disabled miners back out again. And these men, these rescue squads, are kept basically on permanent alert when there's work going on in a mine shaft further back down the line. You have to have your survey who is actually carrying this out. There is a huge amount of work. These are really labour-intensive operations. It almost becomes a miniature industry underneath the Western Front.
Yeah, the complexity, I mean, we could go on for a significant period of time about the complexity of tunnelling and mine warfare on the Western Front. And really, as we said at the start of this episode, it very much does mirror what we see with the trenches above ground. So you start off with a fairly basic line, and then you'll have saps running out, you'll have listening posts and listening galleries. Then eventually you'll get attack tunnels, you'll get dummy tunnels, you'll have subways, which are later on going to be used to transport troops. There's all kinds of things get created. And depending on the sector of the Western Front, where down in the south, for example, the southern part of the British sector, you have a largely chalk-based geology, that can be very effective because it's very secure. It doesn't need as much planking, it's less liable to flood, although you do build things like sumps into there. But in those locations, you can almost create underground cities. Because, of course, we need to remember as well that whilst tunnels and mines are used and used very effectively in an offensive measure, they can also be incredibly effective in defensive, just quite literally removing or reducing the amount of attrition suffered by troops. If your guys are 20 feet below ground, they're very unlikely to get hit by artillery. And we even have sectors of the Western Front where by 1916, you've got troops moving into and out of the line, a traditionally very dangerous point, but they're doing it underground. This is just how big these sectors get. So traditionally, if you imagine in your mind's eye right now, the trench lines of the Western Front, by the middle of 1916, the British sector at least, and particularly the southern part of the British sector, if you see that trench, you can almost exclusively draw another trench, very much following its shape, directly underneath it. This is what's often referred to as a parallel. This is going to mirror the trenches on the Western Front. And from there, you're then going to have a number of things going on. Either what's sometimes known as a subway, which you might see above ground as a communication trench. In some cases, quite literally a subway containing light rail carts and all kinds of things, moving backwards and forwards, allowing the movement of men, material, supplies, and importantly, as you said, spent spoil in and out of those crucial areas. At the same time, though, coming off a bit like tentacles leading off the front edge of those parallels, this is where we start to see attack tunnels. These are typically much smaller. A parallel might be 7 feet tall. It allows a man to walk through, even with a bayonet on his rifle, and you could still get through without hitting the top. They're going to be wide enough for two men to pass easily. They sometimes have passing points cut out into them to allow men to slip into a siding if a rail cart is coming down. The subways themselves, they're going to be very big as well. But by the time we get down to attack tunnels, if you like the pointy end of mine warfare on the Western Front, these bits going towards the enemy, this is where the tunnelling companies come into their own. because this is where you need those specialists. You need those surveyors, because you can't get out above ground and stretch a piece of tape across no man's land up towards the German lines. All of this has to be done below ground, has to be done in silence and in secrecy. It's incredibly labor intensive and nerve straining work as well. The closer you get to the enemy positions, the more likely they're going to be encountering you, or that you're going to find a counter mine or any one of these things that we can talk about as this podcast goes on. Incredibly complex stuff. What we should also remember as well is that it's incredibly dangerous. There are a number of major risks that we need to consider, and it's not just the enemy, Spence.
This is really important point, and it's one of the reasons too why, as the war goes on, the fact that the British are recruiting miners and then making them engineers starts to give the British an advantage in tunneling that ultimately will become greater than that the Germans possess. Because the Germans have a very, very effective pioneer arm, very effective engineering branch who do some superb work for the Germans. They are not specifically miners in the same way that the British are. Yes, there's miners within the German pioneer branch, but they don't have these specific tunneling companies in quite the same way. When you have German mining units, they are pioneers who might be called upon to do a variety of duties. Whereas the British, and British Empire, I should add, because there are also tunneling companies from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, they are miners first and foremost and engineers second. And these men what they have what is known as pit sense in the language of the day. And pit sense just comes from having worked in mines for many years. A sense about when the earth is moving. You could almost describe it as a sixth sense. And in fact, this is referred to as a sixth sense in the First World War, because officers who aren't familiar with miners, there's one or two accounts of this where suddenly a group of miners will come out of a tunnel and say, there's a problem in there. And we're coming out because and this isn't something distinct like carbon monoxide or so forth, but they say that's not right. We need to do something else. And the officer's baffled because he says, well, there's nothing wrong here. That's attributed at the time to a sort of sixth sense that's known as pit sense. When you've worked underground for many years, you just know little things about the ground. And the British Empire's tunnellers demonstrate frequently pit sense. And it's needed because when you're digging these tunnels relatively deep underground, and the tunnels get deeper, incidentally, listeners, I mentioned the early tunnels are relatively shallow. Certainly by 1916, you're getting 16, 17, you're getting tunnels perhaps 80 feet below the ground. So they really have gone quite deep relative to how they begin. You have the risk of cave-ins. You have the risk of collapse. Remember that there are artillery barrages that are rocking the ground above you. You have the risk of flooding, especially in the Flanders region. You have the risk of uncovering gas pockets, which can be very dangerous. And also there's a problem of ventilation. The deeper you get and the further you get into no man's land, the less the oxygen levels are. The British start introducing actually mechanized bellows to pump oxygen around or clear the air in a tunnel, so that the Germans don't really do until much later on. And that innovation has actually come from experience with civilian mining as well. But this is an era of mining when you still take canaries in with you into the tunnels. And of course, if the canary dies, that means there's carbon monoxide in the area, or there's some sort of invisible poison gas, you need to leave. In fact, I'm reminded of a particular cartoon that was produced by the Royal Engineers. It's still, I believe, from memory in the Royal Engineers archive. And it's some British tunnellers are digging in a tunnel and their canary's dead in the cage. And a Royal Engineering officer's come down and said, what's going on, you men? This canary's dead. You need to get out of here. And the miners are saying, there was never a day's work in that canary anyway. Which sort of captures some of the devil-may-care attitude, but in actual fact isn't really true. The miners were very good at understanding when they faced an underground danger, and they weren't going to risk their lives for what was basically natural dangers, gas pockets and so on. They understood these, and they try and do their best to get out of them. But that didn't mean that there weren't casualties as a result of accidents, either flooding, gas poisoning, cave-ins and so on, such as this. And as we've already mentioned, Dan, this is before we even get into enemy action against mine shafts, because something that both sides quickly realize, and I've mentioned it several times already, is the need to intercept and disrupt and destroy the enemy's mining efforts, as well as trying to get your own explosives underneath their trenches.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe a good point to really set out the scene to a certain extent and understand exactly what miners are trying to achieve beneath ground on the Western Front, really from 1915 onwards. Because I think to many of us, it's self evident, but actually it's a lot more complex than that as well. And the crux of the issue, though, as you can imagine, is that Allied miners are trying to get themselves beneath important German positions, and this is an important fact. We're looking for high value targets here, not necessarily trying to get under a stretch of sparsely occupied trench, not necessarily trying to get under a position that may or may not be occupied, but generally speaking, this is an attempt to get under the most heavily manned or heavily defended positions. Redoubts being a great example, concentrations of machine guns. The idea is that the Allies, and of course the Germans are doing the same on the other side, as are the French, are trying to get under those key positions, undermine them. Ideally, then, once beneath them, hopefully undetected, hollow out a large chamber directly beneath that position, fill it full of explosives, and there are a number used at the time, aminol perhaps being the most commonly used one. So fill this area full of explosives and then lay a detonation cable into those explosives. And then, crucially, and this is absolutely crucial, backfill that tunnel or tamp that tunnel as it's known. Because, of course, those of you who are into your into your sciences will realize that if you were to fire off an explosive with a tunnel leading to it, hoping that you're going to blow up a position directly above it, what in fact is going to happen is that explosion is going to travel all the way straight back down the tunnel, following the easiest route possible, and blow your own trench to pieces. So in order to force that explosive up, what needs to happen is that trench needs to be backfilled to the extent that the easiest point of exit for all of that explosive energy is directly upwards through the enemy position. So all of this stuff needs to happen. Ideally, this is going to be done and fired at a time that is most convenient, either for troops going over the top, so the first day of the Somme in 1916, or the opening day of the Battle of Messines Ridge, for example, or it's going to be done in a much more local counterattack method, where sometimes we get what's called the race to the crater. And that's quite simply to capture the rim of the crater that's created above ground. But that itself is more complex because, of course, you don't only get above ground mine charges. There are a number of different mines and explosives used in tunnel and mine warfare during that time. Broadly, you can break it down into three types. You've got offensive mines, you've got defensive mines, and then you've got tactical mines that are used, as we've just described, really on a more tactical level. On the offensive side, you'll see that the common mine is the most, unsurprisingly, the most common one used on the Western Front. And a common mine is quite simply one that is going to burst open, hopefully destroy an enemy position, and leave a fairly traditional crater. So that kind of that lipped edge, if you like, with a big hollow dome in the bottom where the explosive has been forced out. But you also might get, for example, a fougasse mine, which is designed really to shower an area with spoil. So that in itself is a very effective method. If you can bring down tons and tons and tons of earth in a particular direction, and these mines can be fired directionally, you can literally push soil and spoil in a given direction. That can be very effective to block enemy lines of sight, for example, and is used on the Western Front a number of times like that. On the defensive side, you've got camouflage mines, which are designed not to break the surface. And these can range from a 10 or 20 kilogram charge put under an enemy mining position to a hundreds of kilogram charge, which can be used again to disrupt or collapse enemy tunnels, but don't necessarily break the surface. And then you also have things on the tactical side, wombat mines, which again can be used directionally. So it's incredibly complex. And the whole process of this, Spence, is really quite mind blowing in terms of the science involved. But for the guys who were actually in the trench at the time, and this is something we certainly shouldn't forget, the experience of being in a position where you know mining activity is going on, for an infantryman, for example, must have been utterly horrifying.
It's a constant concern. And this is true for both Germans, British, and indeed French, not least because quite often you'll see your own miners working. And you'll know that if your miners are working, then the enemy's miners are working as well. And it's really interesting to reflect on what frightened soldiers in the First World War. what are the things that disturb them? We mentioned on the previous trench raid episode that there's a real loathing of both being trench raided and trench raiding itself in many cases. The close range, point blank nature of the violence, the fact it occurs at night and so on. One thing, though, that the soldiers have on top of this is a fear of being undermined. And it goes down to this, I think, a very human fear, a fear of being buried alive, which is something I hope happens to none of us in our lifetimes, but is a fear that nags and gnaws and troubles soldiers when they know they're in a heavy mining sector. And it's something that the soldiers sometimes laugh about. Of course, there's a risk of being buried alive just by explosions. Enemy artillery may bury you. This does happen. But the idea that at one moment you're going to be stood in your trench and the next you're going to be either blown sky high by an underground explosion or the trench is just going to collapse in on itself and you're going to be buried alive is really disturbing. And although it gives soldiers a lot of joy, and that sounds pretty ghastly, but that's the case, to see one of their mines detonate on an enemy line. The fear that it's going to happen to you really, really troubles the soldiers. And I mentioned that soldiers really don't like doing the labouring work that tunnellers require them to do, moving spoil and so forth. As well as that, there's also a sort of concern about, oh my gosh, if our miners are hard at work, then the enemy's miners must be hard at work as well. And so there's this sort of nagging fear if you're in a heavily mined sector. And it has to be said that there's certainly sectors of the French and German lines that are heavily mined, but mining in its biggest and perhaps its most important sense tends to occur opposite German and British sectors. One exception to that is Verdun, where there's an awful lot of mining in 1916. But really, it's the British and the Germans who are often locked in this mining war. And I think it affects both British and German soldiers equally, this constant fear that their trenches are going to collapse, they're going to be entombed below. And this is, such a human reaction, I think, and speaks to a sort of deep human fear that even in the midst of all this industrialized war, bullets, explosions, shrapnel, there's this fear, well, at least I can face the enemy, I can see what's coming at me, or face it with my chest to it. Whereas the ground collapses beneath me and I plummet into the earth, that's a different kettle, a different case entirely. And I think that's it gnawed certainly at soldiers in all the sectors where this was going on, and understandably so.
Yeah, 100%. There's the famous phrase that's used really throughout 1915 and 16. You don't need to be worried when you can hear the enemy digging. You need to be worried when they stop. And because, of course, it means they've dug their tunnel, they're now filling it with explosives and tamping it back and all of that kind of thing. That's when you need to not be in the area. But, of course, people do need to man those lines. But you can just imagine the fear and the uncertainty, much like you said, Spence, there with regards to things like trench raiding. There are a number of different uncertainties on the Western Front, but you can just imagine the cumulative effect of this not knowing must have been absolutely nerve-shattering. And no wonder things like trench rotation are so important on the Western Front. I know we've covered them before, but you just imagine all of these different dangers that are ever present but never seen. And my God, what bravery that takes. And of course, from the miners themselves as well, they certainly show plenty of bravery. And there are a number of individuals, and one of them I just wanted to mention briefly, because today the Tunnelers Memorial at Givenchy, which in fact is where the very first German mining goes on, and probably in the British sector, I would say the most heavily mined area of the entire Western Front at that time. In that same sector, actually, in June of 1916, a man by the name of William Hackett, I think, displays really what you could sum up as the, if you like, the courage of the miner as a whole, because he is a professional miner. He's actually tried to enlist 3 times on the outbreak of war, being 41 years old at the time, too old for overseas service, as well as being under the minimum height requirement. But when mining comes along, he all of a sudden goes from being somebody that nobody wants to employ in their infantry battalion to somebody that everybody wants to have hold of, because he's a very professional miner. And there's a citation I'm just going to read out really briefly, Spence, because it's stunning in terms of, displaying just what William Hackett and so many other miners achieved in the Great War. And it reads as follows. For most conspicuous bravery when entombed with 4 others in a gallery owing to the explosion of an enemy mine, After working for 20 hours, a hole was made through fallen earth and broken timber, and the outside party was met. Sapper Hackett helped 3 of the men through the hole and could easily have followed, but refused to leave the 4th, who had been seriously injured, saying, "I am a tunneler and must look after the others first." Meantime, the hole was getting smaller, yet he still refused to leave his injured comrade. Finally, the gallery collapsed, and though the rescue party worked desperately for 4 days to attempt to reach the 2 men, it failed. Sapper Hackett, well knowing the nature of sliding earth, the chances against him, deliberately gave his life for his comrade. That was actually published in the London Gazette, dated the 4th of August 1916, and it's, of course, the citation to a Victoria Cross. Now, I think the really powerful thing about this is William Hackett's body was never recovered, and 110 years later, he's still directly beneath that area where he lost his life in 1916. Very powerful story.
Extremely so, and his comment, his last words, effectively, that he's not going to leave his men behind. "I am a tunneler. I must look after the others first," I think captures something that's particularly evident in British Empire tunneling companies. It goes back to that point we were making earlier, that these are explicitly recruited as miners, first and foremost, who then become soldiers. And in mining in the early 20th century, it is a very dangerous profession. It's well paid because it's dangerous and it's difficult. And there's an unspoken compact between miners that if somebody's left behind, if somebody is buried alive, if somebody's trapped in a collapsed tunnel, you will do everything in your power to try and rescue them. And in a way, it's what gives and this applies also to French and German mining companies too, it's what gives these units this incredible, determined esprit de corps. And what William Hackett does is quite rightly rewarded the Victoria Cross, sacrificing himself, taking enormous risks to rescue the others first. He has to do this. It's part of this. And this leads quite nicely, in a way, I think, into the dangers and pressures. We've talked about the fear, of course, of being an infantryman and you're in a trench, you're worried it's going to collapse underneath you. There's also, of course, there are dangers as a miner. And we've mentioned previously the risk of natural effects, cave-in, gas pockets, and so on. But of course, what causes William Hackett and his men to become buried is the Germans have detonated a mine themselves, the Red Dragon mine, which creates a crater in the area, which the explosion of that causes the tunnel to collapse. This is, we've mentioned several times about intercepting enemy enemy digging that's trying to reach your trenches and intercepting it. And in 1915, when tunneling is still relatively crude, this can quite literally mean you tunnel into an enemy's tunnel, and sometimes by accident, sometimes deliberately, and you actually burst into that tunnel at extremely close range, more or less pitch dark, it's very narrow in there, and you try and kill the miners or disrupt the miners as by bursting in. And anybody who's a fan of Peaky Blinders, the British TV series, will know that Tommy Shelby is traumatized by having that happen just to him. And he has nightmares about it, about the Germans digging into a tunnel that he's working in the First World War and attacking from that position. Now, this does happen in 1915. Sometimes it happens accidentally. The two tunnels just happen to meet each other, or they become very aware they're next to each other by the sounds of picks working. In other occasions, people dig into the tunnels and actually steal or break equipment. There might not be anybody working in there, but you try and break the equipment. But those instances of actually digging into enemy tunnels and then trying to carry out effectively a raid or an assault actually become rarer as the war goes on, because both sides start deploying advanced listening devices that can be used to actually hear the approach of enemy tunnels, and it makes it very difficult to dig into a tunnel like that. And so instead, what starts getting used are, rather than trying to go in and assault the miners, instead you'll place an explosive, usually a camouflage, one of these mines that doesn't breach the surface, to create a collapse in the enemy's tunnel. And you only need to get it relatively close, because the explosion underground will reverberate, it will cause collapse. And so rather than risking your own troops by digging into their tunnel where a melee is going to break out and anything can happen, you're going to try and destroy their mine shaft, destroy their tunnel by blowing it up. And that will quite literally entomb miners alive. And so as the war underground becomes more and more complex, there's a huge amount of effort put into it by both the British, the Germans, and indeed the French to use listening devices to try and hear where the enemy are digging and try and do something about this. And both sides realize, well, the enemy is listening to us. What can we do to distract them? So, for example, the British introduce an automated pick that you place on the end of it's actually on a wheeled contraption. You put it at the end of the tunnel and it's automated, so it just keeps picking away. And of course, anybody operating a German listening device will hear that and say, oh, there's digging going on there. We need to do something about that. But in fact, it's just a dummy roost. The Germans use something similar as well. So the war underground, it's very dangerous for the miners because of natural conditions. It's dangerous because of explosives. And you start to see all these innovations, all these technological aspects come into it to try and give the mining forces an advantage over one another. And it's gone from just, I don't want to say haphazard, that's not quite the right word, but really civilians at war digging underneath trenches and trying to do something, to its own miniature war, which is noted. The rules of underground warfare are completely baffling to soldiers who aren't part of the tunneling or engineering companies. All the little considerations they have, all the little concerns and problems and innovations they use. It is a war unto itself in many respects, but certainly in 15 and 16, it's a very bitterly fought one.
It is, absolutely. And, you can imagine the horrors of fighting hand to hand in any situation, let alone using candlelight and not knowing anything about your enemy and fighting underground in a tunnel. Absolutely horrific. And you can understand, just why it takes that amount of courage for these men. And just a word on this, Spence, actually, whilst we're talking about these men, it's worth pointing out that these guys are really, as well, interestingly, from certain areas of the country. And it's true of each of the countries that they belong to. Because, of course, we have really high proportions of miners in certain parts of the UK. So in the northeast, in the areas around Durham and Northumberland, traditionally tough, hard-working life up in the northeast of the UK. Lots of tunnellers recruited from there. You get tin miners from down in Cornwall in the UK get recruited. You get guys from, in fact, the Luce and Lille region of France, which is where much of the fighting is going on. That's a big coal mining region before the war. They end up in the French army doing exactly the same thing as sappers in the French engineers. And the same thing happens with Germany as well. So, you look at something like 37 different pioneer companies created in Germany, and you get about 33 of them are from Prussia, based around places like the Harz Mountains. You get a couple of guys from Bavaria. You get a couple of guys from Württemberg. You get a couple of guys from Hesse. So all of these kind of areas, but some of them where you get much higher propensity. And they don't always have the same mindset as well, Spence, which I think makes really interesting ways of thinking about things. As we've mentioned many times before, a tin miner from Cornwall is not going to be anything really like a coal miner from Durham. And the same thing happens in Germany. And in fact, it's maybe even slightly more difficult to understand as a result of the complexity of German history.
It really is. And we've mentioned this many times, in fact, on the podcast, about the fact that Germany is a relatively new state, is actually a collection of existing states that are now combined into the German nation, which only forms, of course, as a formalized state in 1871. And this is something that we get asked a lot about, in fact, on the podcast, get a lot of contacts saying, can you do some more about the Germans and about how the German side works? And this, I think, is actually an opportunity for us to recommend a podcast to our listeners, Dan.
Absolutely, Spence. It's a fascinating story, and one that we'll certainly cover in our own time when we look at the individual combatant nations in more detail. But if you really want to know more about this, far more detail than we can put in, why not check out Dirk Hoffman-Becking's great podcast called History of the Germans. It's a narrative telling German history basically from the coronation of Henry the Fowler in 919 AD right up to 1990. And he does a pod, I think, about 20 to 30 minutes long every week. And he's working his way through history at the moment. I'm finding it really interesting to understand kind of the intricacies of how these nation states come together. And it really gives a good idea, actually, of just how intricate the story of Germany is in 1914-18, because it does play a huge part, a huge role on the Western Front. So if, like both of us, you find this interesting, why not check it out? It's called History of the Germans. Just head over there and see what you think. I love it, and I think it could be a really, really interesting way to kind of learn a bit more about Germany in terms of their First World War story as well. But don't get too sidetracked, Spence. We'll stick with the mining story, because we've looked at kind of the mechanics of mining to a certain extent, some of the dangers that are involved. What we need to consider as well is the particular situations in which they're employed, because they're not just fired off, really by 1916 at least, they're not just fired off randomly because there's a particularly annoying machine gun in a position. In many cases, they're really been brought into the arsenal of commanding generals as another weapon that they can employ in trying to break this famous deadlock of trench warfare on the Western Front. And we see them employed in major over-the-top offensives as well, don't we?
We do, and as tunneling goes from its relatively amateur's not quite the right word, but from its relatively humble beginnings in 1914 and 15 and starts to become a ubiquitous feature, as we've mentioned, as the sophistication of tunneling grows, as the quality of high explosive you can use in a mine shaft grows, inevitably it starts getting associated with much more serious plans and much more serious work. It's going to be used as part of your offensive playbook, your toolbox. If you can detonate a series of mines underneath an enemy position as your assault begins, then that's going to give you a great advantage. The mentioned before, the experience of being blown up by a mine is terrifying and disorienting and demoralizing for the defender, gives the attacker potentially a great opportunity to attack. And as the British expand their mining efforts, it's matched really by the Germans expanding their mines. And if anything, the Germans get more and more put on the defensive through late 15 into 1916 because the British are mining so intensely. The mining moves from the Flanders region down to the Somme, where there's a whole host of new problems because you're digging through chalk rather than digging through clay. That requires a different approach. It's a lot noisier to dig through clay as well, so the enemy can hear you. You have to take measures to try and reduce this. And of course, as part of the looming Battle of the Somme offensive, the British are going to make massive use of mining to try and undermine, weaken, destroy, damage, degrade the German trenches. The Germans are well aware this offensive is looming. It's obvious from really about March 1916 it's going to happen. So the Germans shoot out their tunnels to try and intercept the British. And the Germans also, let's not forget, and the British do this to a lesser extent, but the Germans are willing to plant mines in no man's land. The idea being that if a British attack is coming, then you detonate the mine in no man's land to blow up British troops as they're attacking, or at least disrupt their approaches. So both sides are mining intensely on the Somme. And coincidentally, at about the same time, there's very heavy mining work going on, French and Germans digging against each other down on the Verdun sector as well. So I think we could say that 1916 is in some ways the industrialization of mine warfare, because the Somme is going to become quite notorious for its use of mines. And we can still see the evidence of these mine shafts, or at least the explosions they create to this day.
Yeah, very true. And actually, you just reminded me of an important problem that I think we need to cover when we think about mining in terms of its use in an offensive capacity, at least. Mines take a hell of a long time to dig. They're not quick. And, if, for example, when we look at the Somme, which is going to be launched, of course, on the 1st of July, 1916, or infamously launched on that day, in fact, to actually create mines that are going to cover 300-400 meters in some case, because no man's land can be pretty sizable in certain locations, it's going to take months. It's going to take a lot of mining, and a lot of things need to go right for you to be able to get a mine gallery all the way across that area undetected, and then undermine a key German position without being detected again, and then fill in an explosive and all of this kind of thing, and make it go bang at the right time on the right day. A lot of stuff needs to go right for that to happen. There's so many variables in there. You could have a problem. You could just get your trench flooded. It might dampen and destroy all of your explosives. You might be detected 360 meters into your 370 meter run, and all of that effort is wasted. The enemy lines above ground might move forwards or move back, and your mine is no longer exactly under the position it needs to be under. So many different things can happen. That being said, there's a lot of manpower available to try and solve this problem, because as we've discussed in previous episodes, there are major problems getting across no man's land above ground. And this is seen as perhaps one of the ways to deal with that. I think when it comes to the story of the 1st of July 1916, the two most famous of many mines that actually go off that day, it should be said. One of them is going to be in the northern sector of the Somme. It's going to be around a place called Hawthorne Redoubt, and it's a strong German position overlooking an area that's famously known as the Sunken Road today, attacked by the Lancashire Fusiliers. That mine is going to be placed. It's going to be placed pretty well. It's going to be set off at a ridiculous time of 7:20, 10 minutes before the main attack goes over. It, in fact, does far more harm than it does good on that day. Further down the road, though, just astride the Albert-Bopham Road, you get a huge mine crater, which is utterly spectacular for anyone visiting the Somme. It's known as Loch Nagar. That's going to go off, I think it's 7:28 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916. It's actually going to miss the German, the main German position it's due to destroy. It comes up about 20 or 30 yards short of that position, but it does so much damage to the area that certainly the defenders are not having a good day at all. But that also brings out another problem here, Spence, as well. You know, we can look at these things today and say, well, dig a tunnel 300 meters long, make sure you're going generally the right direction. That's much easier said than done, particularly when you can't get out and measure it above ground.
It's so true. This is really, really hard technical work, even before you think about the physical aspects of actually digging a tunnel. And just as you were talking about the sheer labour that's involved in this tunnel construction, I'm reminded of an absolutely great quote that's from 1918 that I'm going to read out. It's a relatively long quote, but I think it reflects, it's from a British perspective, but it could be applied to the French or the Germans equally. And it goes like this. Everybody damns the tunneler. General Headquarters, because he invariably has his job finished months before the rest of the army are ready for the great push. Army troops, because he invariably upsets all their preconceived notions as to the safety of trenches and dugouts. Divisional troops damn him because he is an outsider in their sphere of influence. Brigade troops, because he refuses to move when they do, and because he knows by heart that part of the line to which they have come as strangers. Brass hats, because they dislike his underground habits. Regimental officers, because he refuses to allow them to use his deep and snug dugouts. Subalterns, because of his superior knowledge. Tommies, because he is the direct cause of numerous extra fatigues. And, alas that it should be so, because of his extra pay. And last and loudest, the Boche damn him, because of his earnest and unceasing attempts at uplifting and converting them into surprised angels. It is also owing to his success in the noble work of the missionary that the tunneler is highly respected by all branches of the forces. And so, in a way, that is a great summation from it's a British perspective, but it could go for any army about the tunnelers. When they're digging, they're incredibly annoying to the army. They're getting in the way, they're not working, they don't play well with others often, they require lots of resources that the other units want themselves and can't really spare, issues of timing or the difficulty that goes into it. But when those mines are successful, that's when you suddenly realize the potential value of these tunnelers, that all that work may well save your infantry's lives, and it may well mean the difference between victory and defeat. And on the Somme, of course, on the first day of the Somme, it's not the fault of the miners themselves that the Hawthorne Ridge mine it proves really a detriment to the Allied attack. It's actually because the commander in that sector, Alma Hunter Weston, doesn't really understand mining. He doesn't really understand mine warfare. He's worried that the explosion of the mine is going to injure his own troops and cause casualties there. So he orders it detonated 10 minutes before the attack begins. And this is about as disastrous as you could get. It means all the initial shock's gone. The Germans have reacted. They know the attack is coming. You don't blow up a mine that large unless you're going to do something about it, because it will have taken weeks and months and enormous amounts of effort. So you don't just waste it as a stunt. It's an indication the attack's coming. And perhaps that's a story in itself, that for all the work the miners do, and this is true incidentally of the Germans, one of the big complaints the Germans have is that the rest of the army doesn't understand what they're doing, and it's always asking them to do other things and taking them away from digging and tunneling. So I think what this perhaps expresses is army commanders who don't come from an engineering or tunneling background, of course, sometimes they don't really appreciate or understand exactly what the miners and tunnelers are doing. But gradually, I think, as a result of the Somme, where hundreds of mines are detonated by either side, gradually, both the British and the Germans will become more and more aware of the need and the importance of mining and the importance of listening to their miners. And perhaps as we move into 1917, we see that the culmination of mine warfare, and it's quite clear by 1917 that the British Empire is starting to get an advantage in mine warfare. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is the tunnelers are just getting more and more experienced, and the army is getting more experienced at taking advantage of the tunnelers. They're respecting their work, more resources are being dedicated to them, whilst at the same time, German tunneling is being hampered because there's an urgent need for experienced miners to be taken from the Western Front and go back and work in the mines in Germany. And actually, towards the end of 1916, as the German army reorganizes itself after the Battle of the Somme, there's also a reorganization in Germany. There's a new industrial program called the Hindenburg program, this attempt to really ramp up military production. And as a part of that, they need a lot more coal. How are you going to get coal? You need miners. It takes a long time to train a miner to make them really effective. So the Germans actually start taking the miners out of the front line and sending them back home. And that loss of experience can't be made up so easily. And so in 17, we start to see the Allies getting the upper hand in mine warfare. And it's going to lead to some pretty spectacular results.
It is, and I just want to pick up on something you mentioned a minute ago. I think we may have been a little remiss in mentioning so far, because you used, of course, the word empire there. And when we've been saying British miners throughout this episode, of course, we don't necessarily mean British miners, because there are significant contributions made from the rest of the then empire. In fact, if you take all of the tunnelling companies out on the Western Front, you have, by the end of 1916 at least, you have 25 that have been raised in Britain. So 25 imperial tunnelling companies, a further three are Canadian raised, 3 are Australian raised. 1 is from New Zealand. There's even by 1917 a Portuguese mining company that's incorporated into the BEF. The most famous of those from the rest of the empire, I think, is going to be the Australian Electrical, Mechanical, Mining and Boring Company, which is a bit of a mouthful to say on a regular basis. So, understandably, it becomes shortened to the ABC Company. That actually is later going to get split up and is going to be broken down into smaller mining companies. But it is in fact those guys who are going to play a remarkable part at the crown jewel of mining and tunneling in the First World War, which is going to be the Battle of Messines. Just before we get there, Spence, I think we need to make honourable mention to another action that takes place in 1917 between the Somme and Messines itself, and that's the actions in and around Arras. Because whilst there isn't necessarily a huge amount of offensive mining done, actually the work that miners and tunnellers achieved during that time really is notable. Because, of course, one of the big problems we've discussed in previous episodes when it comes to making a formal over-the-top attack are things like aerial reconnaissance. If you can fly an aircraft over an area and find 25,000 enemy soldiers behind the lines, you got a pretty good idea that something's going to be going on. Well, if you can hide those 25,000 soldiers, and there's not many places to do it in a world that has aerial reconnaissance, you can maintain the element of surprise. And the Battle of Arras is a great example of that.
It is, and it speaks to something that we've perhaps hinted at, but we haven't quite got to grips with yet. And that's that, although we think about mining in an aggressive sense, dig underneath the enemy, blow things up, mining and working underground also has other uses. Creating deep dugouts that will protect your infantry, creating tunnels that infantry and indeed supplies can move up and down. On the Somme, for example, perhaps the most impressive feat of German engineering is not digging tunnels out towards the British, but instead constructing these incredibly robust dugouts in which the infantry and indeed the artillery can shelter during British bombardments before re-emerging. And in the build-up towards the British Empire assault at Arras and, of course, Vimy Ridge, the use of tunnels, and some of which are sort of exist naturally in the region, it's honeycombed with tunnels, and their expansion and improvement by the Royal Engineers is absolutely remarkable because it allows thousands of Allied assault troops. Though it's not potentially the most comfortable billet, you are completely safe in these. So the Germans aren't going to disrupt you with artillery fire. The Germans aren't going to be able to observe you with their aerial observers, their flyovers, and their air observation balloons. And it's an incredible feat of logistics and engineering to create the space for these soldiers and also allow them to be supplied. Because you can't just put all these soldiers on below ground and say, well, wait there for 48 hours and not bring them food, water, provide sanitation facilities and so on. It's absolutely a remarkable engineering feat that takes advantage of existing features and then expands them greatly. And it plays a significant factor in the opening success at the Battle of Arras, because it does achieve a degree of surprise that had not been possible in at the Battle of the Somme, for example. It's not a complete surprise. There's been a long bombardment beforehand, but the scale of the assault and the fact that the troops are fresh, because they don't have to be repairing the trenches, they don't have to be digging and things like this. They can basically, it's a bit boring in the tunnels, but you're completely safe. You can then burst into action and you're fresh and you're ready to go. And that's a really, really important factor, I think, in the underground war on the Western Front, that all sides also construct all kinds of protections, dugouts, ammunition dumps that require an enormous amount of digging. And although the tunnelling companies are focused overwhelmingly on digging underneath the trenches, engineers also dig all over the Western Front. And without them, the trench system just wouldn't work. So that's, I think, an important factor to consider.
It is. There's so many different elements, and we're probably running a little short for time. So maybe we'll have to come back and revisit tunneling and mine warfare in the future. But of course, there are so many. By the time we reach 1917, you've got something between 30 and 40,000 British and Empire tunnelers alone involved in solving these conundrums that appear on the Western Front. You know, of course, similar numbers on the German and the French, and even sides further down, the Italians and Russians as well. So there's lots going on in and around this area, and because of this build up of expertise that's arrived through, you know, let's face it, some pretty stern lessons that have been learned in the years before, we finally get to a point where I at least to my mind, Spence, I'll be interested to see what you think about this. The Battle of Messines, ultimately, as a set-piece battle, is going to be about the pinnacle of tunnel and mine warfare on the Western Front, which sees initially 26 different mines dug directly under key positions. And one very quick point on this, actually, here, as we've mentioned many times here before, one of the big advantages of the Germans in the Great War is that they have the high ground. High ground is, generally speaking, a really good thing. There's probably only one situation in which high ground is not particularly good, and that's when you're undermining their positions. So there's a lot to bring about in this. So we have huge numbers of tunnels, mines dug directly under German positions. And when it comes to June 1917, there's going to be a huge bang, and the result is really quite remarkable.
This is in many ways the culmination of everything that's been going on in the Flanders sector since 1915. And we have, listeners, if you're interested in the specific details of Messines Ridge and how it fits into the wider British offensive here, we've covered this in our Passchendaele episode, where we go into some depth about Messines Ridge. But the point to tie it to tunnelling is that these tunnels don't appear overnight. This sector has been dug into for years, and it is crisscrossed with tunnels, and it's taken, you could argue, although you'd be playing a little bit with time, you could argue that this is the culmination of about 2.5 years British and British Empire work, because you made a great point earlier, Dan, about the number of Empire tunnelers as well, with tunnelling companies from Australia, Canada and New Zealand also involved on the Western Front. Both sides have been digging all around this sector for really since 1915. There have been mines detonated in other places, and slowly but surely the British have managed to get underneath Messines Ridge. And the Germans have got some awareness, or they know there's a ton of digging going on around here. They have disrupted it in places, but really the scale of the digging and also the depth the British are able to get underneath German tunnels in some cases has surprised the Germans. And it shows actually that by this stage, by mid-1917, British and British Empire tunnelers have got the advantage over the Germans. The Germans, as I said, have lost a lot of their experienced miners. They've been sent back to Germany to work in coal mining, absolutely vital for the German war effort. The British tunnelers are now well equipped. They're highly experienced. They know what they're doing. And really the culmination of all their work in Flanders since they arrived in 1915 is the Messines Ridge, which apparently, there's some dispute about this. It might be the largest man-made noise in history up until this point, with about tens of thousands of pounds of explosives detonate and essentially rearrange Messines Ridge, blow the top off Messines Ridge. If you visit it now, Messines Ridge is a lot smaller than it was at the time. And it gives rise to, I know, what is one of your all-time favourite quotes about the Western Front, Dan.
It does. And I can't not put this into this episode because I just love it. It's a staff officer the night before the assault is due to go off. There are going to be 600 tons of explosives with 19 mines going off sequentially as it happens up and down the Messines Ridge the following morning, the largest of which is 95,000 pounds. That's I did a bit of Googling on this earlier, Spence, to try and give it some context. So it's about 48 tons. That is 9 elephants worth of explosives in one single mine. There we are. That's a terrifying statistic for you. Anyway, the quote as it goes, of course, is from a general just before the assault goes over. And he quite simply says, "Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we shall certainly change the geography." And he wasn't wrong.
Absolutely not. And it gives rise to one of the great British victories of the First World War. It's not just the mines. The mines play a really important role. There's a lot more to the Messines Ridge battle, which we do get into in our Passchendaele episode. But it's the sort of the culmination of everything that has been planned. In a way, it's the pinnacle of John Norton-Griffiths' vision for tunnelling underneath the Western Front and potentially causing immense damage. But let's not forget, it's taken months, years to actually get to this position to do this. And in a way, it's both the culmination of mine warfare and its last major act. Because although mine warfare will continue on the Western Front, both sides will continue to dig at each other more or less until trench warfare breaks down in 1918. It's also reached a point where the sheer effort involved to actually do this, to dig into the enemy and undermine them and so on, that the time-consuming nature of it means it's not suitable really for the war of the war of movement that's going to start in the spring of 1918. Now, mines are used in March 1918. The Germans have dug some mines under the British lines. You also see some mines detonated underneath French positions during the spring offensives as well. But really, the fact that the Western Front begins to break down in 1918 means that the tunnelling, which is so time-consuming, just becomes less and less important. You just don't have the time to actually dig into the ground and burrow underneath it when the front line is moving relatively quickly.
Yeah, really, the last British mine, to the best of my understanding, is actually fired on the 10th of August, 1917. So from that point onwards, despite this great success that we've seen as recently as June of that year, really mine warfare comes to an end at least in an offensive sense. There are major concerns in 1918 that, in fact, a lot of British tunnels underground, particularly in the Loos sector, they're actually adapted in order to cater for the fact that they know that there's a spring offensive coming. And you see things like Bastille doors erected into tunnels, and you see camouflage set within British trenches as defensive measures. So you see all of this. There doesn't mean there's no longer a use for tunnelers. There certainly is, and tunnelers and miners are going to be useful right up until the very morning of the armistice. But in terms of its heyday and if you like the culmination, as you said, Spence, of the technology of mining in the Great War, I would argue that the Battle of Messines really underscores that and does so effectively, and I think in a way fittingly, because I think to finish this off, we shouldn't forget that none of this comes free, none of this expertise is learned easily. The risks and the determination and the courage of these guys is absolutely extraordinary, and perhaps the best way to remember that is to understand that with the Britain and British Empire alone, forgetting, of course, the French and the German numbers for a moment, there are 181 officers and around 3,000 tunnelers killed on the Western Front in the Great War.
A really powerful statistic, and it's worth remembering that within those numbers, 3,181 officers and men, about a third of those men die underground, either in accidents or as a result of German action. And in many cases, therefore, their grave is the tunnel in which they were operating in when it was destroyed. And we don't have French and German mining casualties to hand, but I would suspect they're in a similar region to this. And in a war that's, of course, features mass casualties and extreme dangers for the soldiers, I think being a miner and having that risk of being buried alive and entombed almost every day that you would go into your tunnel. And it's not just a case of mining as in a civilian industry, which is dangerous in itself. It's also mining where an enemy is actively trying to find you and, if necessary, kill you. It really did require a certain stamp of individual, I think. And these were very, very tough, very hardy men in a war that was filled with that type of man. And it's interesting to reflect how small the tunnels that they were working in were as well. You mentioned this earlier, Dan, how narrow they were, how small they were. And I know that you've got a particular insight into this because you've actually been into some of those tunnels on the Western Front today.
Yeah, I'm very lucky to have been able to do that. I've worked over the last, probably coming up the last 10 years now with organizations in trying to uncover tunnels beneath the Western Front, map them, many of these were closed over at the end of the war, so the tunnel systems themselves still remain there, but quite often what the farmers would have done in the 1920s and 30s is they would have replowed their fields and they would have pushed all the spoil from the battlefield, all the detritus and debris down the tunnel shafts. And so the tunnel shafts themselves are blocked, but beneath the Western Front, even to this day, there are literally hundreds of miles of tunnels still existing, in many cases unexplored and untouched since the day the guns fell silent in 1918. It's a remarkable experience, one that I highly recommend. Every now and then I take groups out to the battlefields and we spend days exploring underground in tunnels, as I say, sometimes never seen before. Of course, there are safety concerns, and it has to be done in the right way and with all of the usual bits alongside it. But one of the things I think that I can almost guarantee is every individual group that I've ever taken, and we've done a bit of tunneling beneath the Western Front on a battlefield tour, it's always their number one experience, the standout moment from a tour of the Western Front. It's a remarkable place. It's a remarkable story, and of course, there were remarkable men that did that job in the first place. And what a pleasure to tell their story today. So, hopefully, you guys have found it interesting. It's certainly a topic that we'll return to in the future. There's still much more to say. We've almost run out of time on this one, Spence. As always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you to you, Spence, and a particular thank you to our patrons who your support really makes an enormous difference in allowing us to keep producing content like this. So if you haven't already listened to our annoying jingle where I talk about Patreon at the end of each episode, do please make it at least a consideration of it. It really does help us out. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. And to if you like to detonate that position or to subvert somebody else's up, didn't I?
You've undermined yourself, Dan.
Touche.